The last few months, I've been trying to bring us back to the basics with regard to our walking with God. We've been talking about listening to God's voice. We've also been talking about being filled with the Holy Spirit, bearing fruit in the Spirit. We've also talked about a couple of other things in process. Abiding, being grafted in, and bearing fruit, becoming more dependent. And so in keeping with that, I wanted to talk just a little bit this morning about discipleship. And so it looks like a classroom up here, and I guess it will be in a way. This isn't going to be your typical sermon, because I'm going to ask for some interaction from you, and hopefully you'll be able to give it. So first of all, when you think of church, what is it you think of? People? Okay. What kind of people?
All kinds.
Okay. What's that?
God.
God. You think of God? Mm-hmm.
Sinners.
Yeah, sinners.
Comfort for me.
Comfort. Mm-hmm.
Conflict.
Conflict.
Fellowship.
Fellowship. Okay. Well, you guys are doing a great job avoiding this building, aren't you? This building is 153 years old, and it's been standing here as a church. And people think of the building as their church. They might even think of the organization as the church. The church in the early days, when we read about it in the Bible, was not quite so organized. It was a little bit different back then. They didn't have a building that they would meet in. What they would do is go from house to house, and within those houses they would sometimes meet within a closed door in a room where the lights are darkened so that the authorities wouldn't know where they are, and then they would move through a different house the next night. And they did meet more than just once a week, which was another difference between the church back then and the church that we have today. You know, not to say that what we have today is wrong. Sir, far be it. It's just that we need to remember that after 2,000 years, we might take on some traditions that may or may not be helpful in terms of our discipleship. Because really, discipleship is what it's all about. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Before we do, there are a few words that I think have changed meaning over time. The first word that I'd like to talk about is the word preach. When you think of preaching, what do you think of? What do you need to preach? A mouth? Okay. Okay, well, some people think that you need a microphone, right? Or other people might think you need a collar. Other people might think, well, you need a presentation, otherwise it's not going to be effective. All of these things are trappings. And oftentimes we seem to think that the preaching is to be left only, exclusively to the professional. If you look at the early church, there were no professionals. And again, this is one of those things that eventually developed even during the early church. They did have elders, they did have pastors, they did have apostles, and these people did help to organize, and they did teach effectively. But the purpose of it was not so that you had to go to that person to get fed. The purpose was so that they could equip you to feed yourself. And I've used this analogy before, but you've got that little baby sitting in the high chair, and you're spooning that food into them, and eventually that baby grabs the spoon for herself and starts to shove the food into her own mouth, and that's really cool. When that happens, that's a breakthrough moment for the parent, right? Because that's one less thing the parent has to do. And that's the way it is spiritually as well. If you look in Acts 8, verses 1 through 4, we find out who the preachers really were. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. So that everyone except the apostles would be like everybody in Royalton except me. You all, in an analogous way, are called out to be preachers. And the only thing that's really required to be a preacher is a message, a messenger, and a willingness to go. So what is our message, class? The gospel. What is the gospel? Right? If you were to try to explain to your next door neighbor the gospel in just a few sentences, what would you say?
Jesus Christ is your one and only Savior. If you want to go to heaven, it's through Him. Read His book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you might even say, if you want to know more, come to our meeting. Right? You don't have to have all of the answers. All you need to do is be able to tell somebody what Jesus has done for you. So preaching has lost its meaning, and now we know what that means. Another word that's lost its meaning is the word church. You know, Jesus did not invent the word church. The word church existed in his day and was used a lot. It basically meant that it was an official gathering for a specific purpose. Matthew 16:18 says, "And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." So whose church is it? It's Jesus' church. So it's not my church, it's not your church, it's Jesus' church. And he's building it, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, when I first thought about this, I was thinking something different than what actually is said here. What is a gate, and what is it used for? Yeah, it keeps people in or out. And whose gates are these? Yeah, these are Satan's gates. So what I'm seeing Jesus saying is that the church is actually knocking down the gates of hell. Right? Which means that we are militant. We are the ones that are aggressing against the world, the kingdom of this darkness. Which makes Satan mad, I'm sure. And that's why he puts so many barriers up against us to prevent us from doing it and to discourage us from doing the things that God is calling us to do. But the reality is, they have no power against us. We, the church, God's church, with the power of Christ, we can overcome strongholds. Strongholds in the community, and strongholds in individual lives. And each one of us, if we have been redeemed, if we have become disciples of Christ, we are, in fact, overcoming strongholds within our own lives. In fact, if you're not overcoming these strongholds, you might want to double check and make sure that you're really following him. Which brings me to the next word, the word Christian. We have adopted the word Christian as a positive thing. In fact, if you look in the Bible, the word Christian only appears 3 times. And each of those 3 times, they were used in a derogatory way. So the church itself never claimed that word for its own. The church simply did not do it. In Acts 11:26, we hear, "And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch." So what did the church call itself? The word is right here in this verse. Yeah. So the people who called themselves disciples were called by people from the outside Christians. And that Christian word was kind of a word to say that they were crazy. They think that somebody actually rose from the dead. In fact, in Acts 26:28, when Paul was giving his testimony, King Agrippa said to Paul, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." Another translation turns it into a question. Are you trying to persuade me to become a Christian? Like, you're nuts. That'll never happen. And Paul's answer was not, yes, I want you to become a Christian. His answer was, I'd like for you to be just as I am, but without these chains. I find that interesting. Which brings me to the last word, which is disciple. A disciple is a student. He's a learner. And again, it's a word that existed long before Jesus came on the scene. It was invented and first used by the Greeks around 400 years before Christ. And there were teachers. We've heard of some of them. Plato, Aristotle. They had disciples. They created schools that went on long after they died. And some of them even lasted right up into the 5th century AD. So a disciple needs a teacher. In the Jewish culture, they called them rabbis. In Jesus' day, there were over 1,000 rabbis, and they all had their disciples. Now, Jesus gives some guidelines for being a disciple of his in Luke 14, verses 26, 27, and 33. He says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And then so likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple." So Jesus is not looking for us to just casually accept him and maybe show up and go away. No, it's either all or nothing for him. You're either all in or you're not in. In fact, he uses strong words. And I guess I should clarify that word, hate. In our culture, we think of the word hate as meaning, I'd like this person to burn in hell for all of eternity. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. That's not the biblical use of the word hate. To hate simply means to give second place to not love as much. God used that in a place. We see it in Romans 9, where Paul quoted the Old Testament, where God says, "Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated." He didn't hate Esau, but he gave preferential treatment to Jacob. Also, Jacob himself used that. You know, he had 2 wives. And he said, "Rachel I have loved, but Leah I have hated." Did he really hate Leah? No. He had a bunch of children through Leah. In fact, after Rachel died, he and Leah became very close. And in fact, he was buried next to Leah. So, to hate your father and your mother, and your sister and your wife, and your possessions, that does not mean that you have to condemn them to hell in your mind. All that means is, when you have to choose between following God and pleasing them, you're going to choose God every time. So a practical definition of the church is a gathering of disciples of Jesus, connected by Jesus, in the power of Jesus, doing the work of Jesus by taking the ground from the enemy. So, it all centers around Jesus, doesn't it? And Jesus calls himself the Word of God, the living Word. So, how do we, as disciples, center ourselves around Jesus Christ? And there are 3 propositions, really quickly. First, read the Word. Second, obey the Word. And third, share the Word.